You know those moments in history that are so incredible, so unbelievable, that you genuinely wonder why you never learned about it in school? Yeah, this is one of those stories. In 1918, while America was fighting for freedom in Europe, one unit became so feared by the enemy that the Germans literally gave them a nickname, not out of respect, but out of pure terror. They called them the Hellfighters, and the crazy part, their own country didn't want them to exist at all. This is the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the most decorated African-American unit in World War I. And trust me, their journey from being rejected by their own nation to becoming the fiercest soldiers on the Western Front, it's absolutely insane. Black is not a color in the rainbow, that's an actual quote. An actual official quote told to the 369th Infantry Regiment in 1917. Here's what happened. For years, black community leaders in Harlem, New York, were pushing for their own military unit. They wanted to be able to serve their country, to prove their loyalty, to be recognized as full citizens with full responsibility. But every single attempt was blocked by white politicians who basically said, "We don't want a black regiment." Finally, in 1913, after a long battle, a bill passed. Governor William Sulzer signed it into law. The 15th Infantry Regiment of the New York National Guard was officially authorized, and it was going to be the first all-black regiment in New York. Historic, right? But here's the thing, it existed on paper only. Nobody actually showed up to join it because there was zero support, zero resources, and frankly, zero respect. That changed when a guy named James Reese Europe showed up. Europe was a legendary musician, a jazz and ragtime conductor. He'd been performing at high society events in New York. But he wanted to serve his country, so he enlisted and immediately got put in charge of creating a regimental band. And this guy, he had a vision. He got the regiment's commanding officer, Colonel William Hayward, to give him $10,000 to build not just any band, but what would become one of the most iconic military bands in American history. Europe traveled all across America recruiting the best black musicians he could find. He literally went to Puerto Rico and recruited more than a dozen musicians to fill out his ensemble. And suddenly, the 369th wasn't just a regiment on paper anymore. With a band that could actually play, suddenly young black men from Harlem wanted to join. The unit started filling up. By 1917, when America officially entered World War I, the 369th was a fully operational regiment with thousands of soldiers. They were ready. They were motivated. They were excited to prove themselves on the world stage, and then everything went wrong. The 369th was sent to train at Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And if you know anything about the American South in 1917, you already know where this is going. The discrimination was immediate and brutal. The local white population in South Carolina was so hostile, so overtly racist, that local residents started making death threats. There were constant confrontations. White soldiers from other units were harassing black soldiers. Civilians were attacking them in town. The situation got so bad that there was a genuine fear of violence escalating into a full-scale race riot. Military leadership realized they had a problem on their hands. They couldn't keep the 369th in South Carolina without risking a major incident. So instead of saying, "Hey, we need to address this racism in our own country," they did something different. They shipped the regiment out, but not to the front lines, not to combat. Instead, the 369th was sent to France, and when they arrived in December 1917, they were assigned to do labor. Building roads, unloading ships, digging ditches, dock work. The regiment that had been created to fight was literally doing construction work while other soldiers were in trenches. This must have been absolutely heartbreaking. Think about it. These men left their communities in Harlem. They left their families. They volunteered to fight for a country that wouldn't even let them march in a parade because black is not a color in the rainbow. They trained, they prepared. And when they got to France, they were treated like they were only good enough for labor. But here's where it gets interesting. France was in a desperate situation in 1918. The Western Front was a bloodbath. Thousands of soldiers were dying. France was bleeding men, they didn't have enough soldiers, and they couldn't afford to be picky about who they put in combat. So when American General John J. Pershing brought the 369th to France, the French took one look at them and basically said, "Yeah, we'll take them. We need them." Now, Pershing had a complicated history with black soldiers. He'd actually commanded a black cavalry unit called the 10th Cavalry back in the 1890s, and that's where he got his famous nickname, Black Jack. But by 1918, his views on black soldiers had soured. He believed they lacked the education and mental capacity to be effective soldiers. Even so, he couldn't refuse the French. The French asked for the 369th specifically. So Pershing agreed, but with one condition: the 369th would not fight under American command. They'd be completely under French authority. Basically, he was washing his hands of them. And here's the thing that's wild about this: Pershing didn't realize he just made one of the biggest decisions of the war. In March 1918, the 369th officially transferred to French command. And the first thing the French did was re-equip them. Out went the American uniforms, out went the American rifles. The 369th received French Adrian steel helmets, French Lebel rifles, and French uniforms. They officially became part of the French 161st Infantry Division. Some American officers who'd been attached to the regiment weren't happy about the Lebel rifles. One captain named Hamilton Fish complained that the French rifles were nowhere near as good as our Springfields. He was right, the French Lebels were temperamental and annoying to load. But the French had a reason for using them. They were great believers in the hand grenade, and the rifles were really just there to stick a bayonet on. But here's what the French understood that American leadership didn't: these men were soldiers. They didn't care what rifle they were holding, they were going to fight. The French paired each member of the 369th with a French counterpart, a one-on-one mentoring system. The Americans trained intensely with French instructors for 3 weeks, literally near the front lines, with sporadic German aircraft and artillery attacks happening around them. And the French taught them the real tricks of trench warfare, not the textbook stuff, the actual survival tips. How to cut off the tails of your overcoat so they wouldn't get weighed down with mud and water. How to carve grooves in the mud walls with shovels so you could climb out faster. How to curl up balls of barbed wire during the day so they could be unfurled quickly at night. These were experienced soldiers teaching young soldiers how to stay alive in one of the most brutal environments ever created. In May 1918, the 369th took their first combat position. They weren't assigned to some quiet sector of the front. They got one of the widest, most active sectors on the entire Western Front. This was the real deal. And immediately, the 369th proved something that America's leadership didn't believe: that these men could fight. The Germans launched the Second Battle of the Marne in mid-July 1918. This was Germany's final major offensive of the war. It was supposed to be the knockout blow that ended the fighting and gave Germany victory. The 369th Infantry was directly in the path of this assault. What happened next was extraordinary. The Germans threw massive artillery barrages at the 369th's positions. Shells were screaming overhead constantly. The forest around them was literally being torn apart by explosions. Soldiers were dying, limbs were being blown off. The sound alone would drive you insane. It was an unending thunder of death. A private named Horace Pippin, who later became a famous painter, wrote about it. For 2 nights they gave us shell fire, and the gas was thick, and the forest looked like it were ready to give up all its trees every time a shell came crashing through. We barely knew what to do, for we could not fight shells, but we could the Germans. We would rather face the Germans coming over the top than to have their shells. But the 369th held. While German soldiers attacked their positions, while artillery was pounding them, while poison gas drifted through the trenches, they held every single inch of ground. The Germans kept pushing. Wave after wave of German soldiers came at the 369th's trenches, trying to break through their lines. And the Americans, the black Americans that their own country didn't want to fight, stood firm. By the end of the Second Battle of the Marne, the German offensive was broken. Germany had failed to achieve its final victory, and the 369th had played a major role in stopping them. The regiment lost 14 soldiers in that battle alone, with 51 more wounded, but they didn't retreat, not 1 inch. The German soldiers who faced them couldn't believe it. They'd heard the propaganda. They'd been told that black soldiers were weak, they were inferior, they couldn't fight, they were cowards, and then they came face to face with the reality. The Germans started talking about these men. They started using a word to describe them: Hellfighters, not out of respect for their bravery, but out of genuine fear. Word spread through the German ranks about this unit that wouldn't break. Stories started circulating. Officers were telling their men, watch out for the Hellfighters, they're fierce. They're relentless, if you run into them, you're in trouble. And that's when the Germans did something really interesting. They started dropping propaganda leaflets over American lines. They were specifically targeting the 369th. The leaflets basically said, your own country doesn't value you, your own military leadership doesn't respect you. You're dying for a nation that treats you as second-class citizens. Why are you fighting? Why don't you just surrender? Why don't you desert? It was a brilliant propaganda strategy, actually. The Germans understood the painful irony that these men were facing. They were fighting for freedom in Europe while their own country denied them basic freedoms at home. And you know what the 369th did? They ignored it completely. Not one soldier in the 369th took Germany up on their offer. Not one deserted, not one surrendered. May 15, 1918, Argonne Forest. 2 soldiers from the 369th, Private Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts, were standing watch in their sector. Both men were alert, both were watching for any sign of movement. Around midnight, they heard something, movement in the darkness, voices speaking German, a raiding party. A group of German soldiers, probably about 12 of them, had infiltrated the line. They were trying to get behind American positions to gather intelligence or capture prisoners. Johnson and Roberts opened fire. The gunfight was intense, chaotic, brutal. Roberts was hit multiple times. He was badly wounded, bleeding heavily. Johnson was also hit, but he wasn't going down. As the fight continued, Johnson realized something terrifying. Roberts was dying, and if he didn't do something, the Germans were going to capture him. They'd take him prisoner. They might kill him. Johnson made a decision in that moment. He pulled a knife, a bolo knife, the kind soldiers used in close combat, and he charged at the German soldiers. He was outnumbered. He was wounded. He was fighting an entire German raiding party alone to protect his friend. What happened next became legend. Johnson fought, he slashed, he stabbed, he used his rifle as a club. He fought with pure desperation and ferocity. One after another, German soldiers went down. They were shocked. They weren't expecting this kind of resistance. By the time the fighting ended, Johnson had killed at least 4 German soldiers, possibly as many as 24, depending on the account. And he did it with a broken rifle and a knife. With nothing but raw courage and determination. Johnson was severely wounded. He had wounds all over his body, but he was still standing, and more importantly, he was still protecting Needham Roberts. The other men of the 369th came running, and the German raiding party was repelled. The Germans retreated back into the darkness, terrified and beaten. When American officers reviewed what had happened, when they saw what Johnson had done, when they heard the stories, they couldn't believe it. This man had single-handedly fought off an entire German patrol with a knife. It was heroic in a way that most soldiers never got to experience. Johnson was awarded the French Croix de Guerre, one of the highest military honors in France. Needham Roberts received it too for his role in the fight. They became the first Americans to receive the Croix de Guerre for bravery. But here's the really messed up part of this story. Johnson wouldn't receive a Purple Heart from his own government for 77 years. 77 years. He spent his whole life waiting for his own country to officially recognize his sacrifice. That tells you everything you need to know about how America viewed black soldiers at that time. But the 369th didn't care about American recognition. They were fighting for something bigger than that. They were fighting for respect, for dignity, for the right to prove that they belonged. And Germany was beginning to understand that they'd made a huge mistake thinking these men were weak. So the stage is set. The 369th Infantry Regiment is in the trenches. They're facing some of the fiercest combat on the Western Front. The Germans are terrified of them, and they're about to embark on the final, most brutal campaign of the war. But before we get there, we need to talk about one more thing. The men of the 369th weren't just soldiers. They were the reason jazz became a global phenomenon. They were musicians and artists and regular guys from Harlem who somehow became the most decorated unit in American military history. And their story is about to get even more incredible. In part 2, we're going to talk about the final offensive. We're going to talk about the men who came home as heroes and faced a nation that still didn't want them. And we're going to talk about why this story matters, why it's important that we remember the 369th Infantry Regiment, because this is American history, real American history. The kind they should teach in schools. When we left off, the 369th Infantry Regiment had just proven something to the world that America's own military leadership refused to believe, that black soldiers could fight just as hard, just as fierce, and just as bravely as any white soldier. They'd spent months in trenches, they'd fought off German attacks, they'd earned the respect of the French army and the fear of the German forces, but September 1918 was coming. And what happened in the next few weeks would cement the 369th's legacy forever. This is where the story gets absolutely brutal and absolutely incredible. September 26, 1918, the Western Front. Germany's final gamble had failed. The Second Battle of the Marne was over. The German army was broken, but Germany wasn't ready to surrender yet. They still had fight in them. And the Allies weren't going to let them escape. The biggest offensive of the entire war was about to begin, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The plan was simple but brutal. More than 1 million soldiers, American, French, and other Allied troops, would attack German positions across a massive front. It would be a coordinated assault designed to break Germany's defenses once and for all. The 369th Infantry was right in the middle of it. Picture this, it's late September, it's getting cold. The leaves are starting to change, and the 369th is about to march into one of the most intense combat experiences in World War I, the Argonne Forest. If you've ever seen pictures of the Western Front, you know what this place was like. Trenches dug into mud, forests torn apart by artillery. The ground is basically a maze of fortifications, barbed wire, shell craters, and death. The 369th had been fighting continuously for months. Most soldiers got rotations. They'd fight for a while, then get pulled back to rest and get replacements. Fresh soldiers would arrive to replace the ones who'd been killed or wounded, but not the 369th. The unit suffered approximately 1,500 casualties, the highest number of any American regiment in World War I. That's not a typo. 1,500 men killed or wounded. And they only received about 900 replacements. Think about that for a second. Imagine a company of 200 men, every single one of them is killed or wounded. You get replacements, so you're up to 200 again. That happens 5 times over. That's what the 369th went through, and the worst part, there were no breaks, no rotation. They just kept fighting, kept dying, kept being replaced by fresh soldiers who didn't know the veteran soldiers. This created a massive problem within the unit. The experienced soldiers, the ones who'd been through months of combat, who understood how to survive, they were dying faster than they could be replaced. New soldiers were coming in, but they didn't have that experience. They didn't know the tricks. They didn't have the brotherhood that the original regiment had built. Command was aware of this. They knew the unit was getting exhausted, but Germany wasn't defeated yet, and so the fighting continued. Here's a statistic that will blow your mind. The 369th Infantry spent 191 days on the front lines. Not days in combat that were non-consecutive, days straight. 191 days without relief. They held one of the widest sectors of the entire Western Front. No American regiment spent more time in continuous combat than the 369th. Think about it. For over 6 months, these men were living in trenches. They were dealing with artillery barrages. They were fighting German attacks. They were dealing with poison gas. They were dealing with cold, wet, muddy conditions. They were hungry. They were exhausted. They were dying, and they never retreated, not once. According to the regimental history written by Battalion Commander Arthur W. Little, the 369th was officially 191 days under fire. They never lost a single foot of ground. And incredibly, they never had a man taken prisoner. On 2 occasions, men were captured by the Germans, but they were recovered. Every single soldier who went into combat came out either alive or dead, but not in German captivity. Only once did the 369th fail to take an objective, and that wasn't because of the 369th's failure. That was because the French artillery support messed up. Think about that. 1 failure in months of continuous combat, and it wasn't even their fault. The Meuse-Argonne offensive alone, the final campaign of the war, was absolutely devastating. The 369th took part in some of the fiercest fighting, including the legendary Belleau Wood and Château-Thierry. At one point during the Meuse-Argonne, 14 soldiers from the 369th were killed in a single engagement, with 51 more wounded. That might not sound like a lot, but when you're talking about a regiment that was already depleted from months of fighting, that's devastating. But the regiment kept pushing. They kept advancing. They kept fighting, and Germany was feeling it. German soldiers who came into contact with the 369th reported back that this unit was different. They were fierce. They were relentless. They didn't back down, they didn't break. No matter what Germany threw at them, the 369th came back for more. Stories spread through the German ranks. One soldier said he'd never seen anything like it. Another said these men fought like they had something to prove, because they did. Every shot they fired was a statement. Every position they held was a statement. Every man who charged across open ground toward German machine guns was saying, "We belong here, we're American soldiers. And we're going to prove it to you." Now here's something that most documentaries won't tell you about the 369th. While they were fighting on the front lines, their regimental band, the one that James Reese Europe had built with so much care, was touring all across France. They were playing concerts for troops. They were playing for French civilians. They were introducing Europe to American jazz. This is actually significant. Before World War I, jazz was almost unknown in Europe. It was an American phenomenon. It was radical. It was black music. It was modern. Europeans had never heard anything like it. And then the 369th's band showed up in Paris. At one concert in the Jardin des Tuileries in Paris, a beautiful public garden in the heart of the city, the band played in front of an absolutely massive crowd. Estimates say there were 50,000 people there, maybe more. British, Italian, and French bands were also performing. When the 369th band started playing, when they started playing W.C. Handy's Memphis Blues and St. Louis Blues, the crowd went absolutely crazy. People had never heard anything like it. The syncopated rhythms, the improvisation, the energy. It was unlike anything European classical music had taught them. James Reese Europe told a reporter, "Everywhere we gave a concert, it was a riot. We played to 50,000 people at least, and had we wished it, we might be playing yet." So while the 369th was fighting in trenches, dying for their country, their band was quite literally changing European culture. They were bringing jazz to the world. They were proving that Black Americans were artists, not just soldiers. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful in a tragic way. Europe himself was serving as an infantry officer while also conducting the band. He eventually got gassed at the front, exposed to poison gas, and had to go to a hospital. While he was recovering, he wrote one of his most famous compositions, On Patrol in No Man's Land. It's a haunting piece of music about the terror of being in the trenches. The fact that a man could be fighting for his life in World War I, get gassed by the enemy, recover in a hospital, and then write a musical composition about his experience, that tells you something about the talent in the 369th Infantry. These weren't just soldiers, these were artists, these were musicians, these were Black Americans fighting for a country that told them they were inferior, November 11, 1918, the armistice. The war is over. The 369th Infantry got the news just like everyone else. The guns went silent. After months and months of constant fighting, the noise finally stopped. The men had survived. Not all of them, 800 soldiers from the 369th never came home, but the regiment had endured, and now they were heroes. The French government awarded the entire regiment the Croix de Guerre, the highest military honor in France. 171 individual soldiers also received the Croix de Guerre for bravery. The unit that America had rejected, that America had hidden away, that America had tried to keep out of combat, they were coming home as one of the most decorated regiments in the entire war. February 17, 1919, 5th Avenue, New York City. 3,000 soldiers of the 369th Infantry Regiment marched up 5th Avenue in a victory parade. It took 4 trains and 2 ferries to get them from Camp Upton on Long Island to Manhattan. The parade stretched 7 miles, and the city of New York went absolutely insane. Not just New York, Harlem went insane. 70% of the 369th soldiers were from Harlem. They were coming home. These were neighborhood kids. These were friends. These were brothers. The Chicago Defender reported that in Harlem, February 17, 1919 was basically an unofficial holiday. The Board of Education actually dismissed school kids early so they could go watch the parade. On 5th Avenue, the crowd was massive, but when they got to Harlem, when the parade entered the neighborhood, it was like nothing New York City had ever seen. The newspaper said the greeting the regiment received along 5th Avenue was to the tumult which greeted it in Harlem as the west wind to a tornado. People were screaming, people were crying. Families were reunited, mothers saw their sons, wives saw their husbands. The neighborhood was literally vibrating with joy. Henry Johnson, the man who fought off 24 German soldiers with a knife, he was riding in a car for the wounded because of the injuries he'd sustained. But he was so moved by the outpouring of love from his community that he stood up in the car, waving a bouquet of flowers, acknowledging the people. Dignitaries were there, the mayor of New York, Governor Al Smith, William Randolph Hearst, they all came out to honor the 369th. For one day, Harlem celebrated heroes, but then reality set in. Remember all those promises. Remember all those speeches about coming home to opportunity, about getting promotions, about finally being treated as equals. Yeah, that didn't happen. While white soldiers came home to promotions and bonuses and job opportunities, black soldiers came home to nothing, or worse than nothing. Many of them faced racial violence. Some were lynched. Others couldn't find jobs because of the color of their skin. White soldiers got to march in victory parades in many American cities. Black soldiers were told they weren't welcome. Some cities refused to hold parades honoring black veterans at all. The 369th had to organize their own parade in Harlem because their own country wouldn't officially honor them. Henry Johnson, the man who'd killed 24 German soldiers to protect his friend, who'd been awarded the Croix de Guerre, who'd been celebrated in France, he didn't receive a Purple Heart from the United States government until 2015. That's 77 years after the war ended, 77 years after he was wounded fighting for his country, and by then, he was dead, so the medal was given posthumously. In 2018, 100 years after the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the U.S. Congress finally awarded Henry Johnson the Medal of Honor, the highest military honor in the United States. For actions he took in 1918, it took 100 years. That's the betrayal, that's the injustice. The men of the 369th fought the most brutal war in human history. They spent more time in combat than any other American unit. They suffered more casualties than any other American regiment. They earned the respect of the French army. They terrified the German army. And their own country treated them like they were worth nothing. James Reese Europe, the legendary bandleader who'd introduced Europe to jazz, was killed in 1919, less than 3 months after the war ended. He was murdered by someone he knew. The circumstances were never fully investigated, and the case was basically dropped. A black man's murder wasn't important enough to solve. The surviving soldiers of the 369th had to rebuild their lives in a country that didn't want them. So here's the question, why does this matter? Why am I telling you this story? Because the 369th Infantry Regiment represents something profound about America. They represent the gap between what America claims to be and what America actually is. America said it was fighting for freedom in World War I, and these men took that seriously. They believed in that promise. They were willing to die for it, but America's freedom didn't apply to them. Not at home, not even after they'd proven their loyalty in the bloodiest war in history. Yet somehow, they're mostly forgotten. Most Americans have never heard of the Harlem Hellfighters. If you ask a random person on the street about the 369th Infantry, they'll give you a blank stare. We teach about World War I in schools. We teach about the trenches, about the battles, about the millions of casualties, but we don't teach about the 369th Infantry Regiment. We don't teach about black soldiers fighting while their own country held them down, and I think that's a problem. The 369th Infantry Regiment proved something that still needed to be proven 100 years later, that courage, bravery, and dignity have nothing to do with the color of your skin. The Germans learned it. The French learned it. The entire Western Front knew that the Hellfighters were some of the fiercest soldiers in the war. But America, the country they were fighting for, took decades to officially acknowledge it. The 369th Infantry Regiment's story isn't just history, it's a mirror. It forces us to look at who we are as a nation. It forces us to ask difficult questions about justice, about equality, about whether we've really come as far as we think we have. These men deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes in a history book, not as a forgotten story. They deserve to be celebrated the same way we celebrate other war heroes. Because that's exactly what they were, heroes, the Harlem Hellfighters, and their legacy lives on.